still fund a program that, if you drop from 24 to 18, you still offer a program and fund the program, not just the number of students. So I guess my reservation is around how this act came to the House, or how this moratorium came to the province, I guess, is what I should be saying. We were coming fast on the heels of an election, Mr. Speaker, and so then there was a moratorium. Well, the moratorium was going to affect members, certainly. I'm not sure about how many members in the House, but certainly some members on the government side. And if there was going to be talk of school closures for some of those members, that would be a pretty tough pill to swallow during an election campaign and try to promote that member. So certainly going down the road of a moratorium just prior to an election and a study just took that right off the table, Mr. Speaker. And I think for me, that's a bit of the concern around the implementation of this legislation. And actually, schools are safe, Mr. Speaker, till March 31st, 2009. The world could shift dramatically, in this province by then. And so it certainly makes me think that there's the possibility in this legislation of protection for the government, up to or past the next election. And so I think a process, a clearly defined process, would be a very good thing. I think that I'd like to see this process improved with having public input at an earlier stage in the process. Matter of fact, at the very first stage, I think would be probably the right place to have it go to the community, have the board go to the community initially and initiate this process and let the community have some input right at the start. I think would be a very valuable thing to do. Mr. Speaker, I think you may be aware of the lay of the land in my own constituency. I have fairly rapidly growing suburban area. Matter of fact, since 1998, we've had 3 new schools built in my constituency in that corridor. But in the more rural area of my constituency, the world is somewhat different. Student numbers certainly haven't been growing. In some cases, I say they've been just static, and maybe enough that the board has not been overly concerned. Matter of fact, it's been the growth in the Hants East area, I think, has been a real benefit for the board overall, because it has been able to keep those numbers up. And maybe the minister can confirm that. And I know that there's probably no one other than the Minister of Municipal Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations who's probably got his finger on the pulse of how the board would look at these issues, and in particular this legislation, but certainly the school closure process. But I know the present minister is very much aware, because I worked with her on a couple of issues regarding schools in my area in her previous life. So I look forward to this bill moving on from second reading, Mr. Speaker, to law amendments. If I get an opportunity, I might try to chat up the minister on some of my concerns and see if she can allay any fears that I have. But certainly a well-defined process would be an improvement for sure. And I want to be sure that the process and the intent of the process are the same thing. So with those comments, I'll take my seat, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to have a few minutes tonight also to speak on this bill number 145, the Education Act, and it's all about our rural schools and I guess urban schools as well, but I guess from a rural constituency, I bring a perspective from Pictou County that about keeping our rural schools open, and that's very important, because I think, you know, our local schools really are the backbone of our communities. It's really the heart and soul of rural areas, and you know, the school really makes a community, and if the school is taken away, certainly it hurts in more ways than one. So this particular bill that the minister has brought forward, and it has some improvements, I think, over the present process that we have, but I question or wonder why perhaps we may even need it at all, because I think we should be trying to build up our schools to make them better rather than tear them down. And but regardless of that, I think if the bill is here, it's for debate or discussion. I guess one thing that I've noticed in the bill that I think is has some merit. It's certainly extremely important that the word closure has been taken out of the process, because there's nothing that instills fear in a community more than if they hear their school is going to close. And if the idea of that word can be referenced out, and maybe a school review certainly has more palatable to a community, easier to talk about. But if you start out by saying it's a school closure study, then almost automatically people are get their backs up, they get their concerns, they're really worried about you know, losing their community school. And I guess I can perhaps most relate to this in the community of River John in my constituency. Before the moratorium come on last year, the process was in place to look at consolidation. Well, it wasn't really closure, it was called school consolidation because they were looking at the junior high aspect, grades 7, 8, and 9, of taking it out of that community, and a number of options were presented. Either the students could go to Tattamagush, to the North Colchester Regional High, possibly they go to Pictou Academy in the town of Pictou, or the third option was to go to Northumberland Regional High School in Alma. But in any regard, it would have meant a long bus drive, up to an hour, to go to Alma, and those students would have been taken out of the community, and people would felt a loss of identity. And there was only one public meeting where people had a chance to express their feelings. It was a large, packed public meeting at the school, and people were unanimous in their opposition to losing their grades 7, 8, and 9 from the River John Consolidated School. And because people feel, you know, that they're losing their children, and they're losing part of their community when a school is up for closure, or part of a school being closed in that particular case. And I can think of other schools in my district that are, through time, have, with declining populations or with change in economic circumstances, there's less children, or there's smaller families these days, and with the birth rate going down, there's you can see the number of children becoming less over time. I think of another school is Salt Springs in Pictou West. It's a relatively new school in comparison to some. It was built in the mid-1970s, and so it's, I think, approximately 30 years old. One of my children attended that school, started there in grade primary, and the first year the school was open, and you know, it was, I think, close to 200 children at that time. Well, today it's, I think, well less than 100 children, I think around 72 at this time. But it's still a very vibrant, healthy school. It's a community meeting place. Parents participate in the classroom. They participate in extracurricular activities. It's sort of the center of the community where people come, and if there's an important meeting, it's often held at the school. If there's sometimes classes put on for community people, I guess it's a true community school in that there's dog grooming classes, there's learning how to digital camera, jazzercise, yoga. There's a variety of courses offered to the adults in the community through the school, and it's not just a meeting place, but it's a chance to learn at all ages, all through your life. And so it's an important community event. It's where young people meet older folks. It's where seniors can interact with children. It's really a strong connection to others in the community. And so again, my question, is why are we talking about closing schools when we should try to be building them up? It makes more sense when a school gets down in numbers than to look at alternatives. What else could you add to that building, to that facility, to that educational institution to make it economically viable? And I know in some other areas of the continent they've looked at some of those alternatives, and to see if could they add a couple seniors units to the school that would fill up some of the empty classroom space, that would allow for some income to help offset the heating costs or the property taxes or other cost of running a building of that size. Is there some government department that could be added to the school facility to bring in a source of revenue that would help alleviate or help share the cost of keeping that facility open? Could you have a tourist bureau in the school if it's in an area that's open to the traveling public? I guess it would have to be, Mr. Speaker, something that's safe, that would mix well with young children if it's an elementary school. But there are some possibilities out there, I think, of mixing economic development with the present school that might have a declining population in order to keep the facility open. My colleague mentions a daycare. Maybe I'm sure there's lots of good ideas to look at building up the school rather than tearing it down. And Mr. Speaker, I want to mention that there are many merits now being discovered about small schools, and at one time it was thinking that bigger was better and that you could have a large consolidated school or amalgamation of several schools, and but that philosophy or that way of thinking is being challenged head on, and there's quite a bit of proof now that smaller schools are better. And Mr. Speaker, there's a report done recently. It was by Mike Corbett of Acadia University and Dennis Mulcahy of Memorial University. They put a study together last year called Education on a Human Scale, Small Rural Schools in a Modern Context. And they have a lot of good proof in there that, yes, smaller schools can be viable, can be perhaps even better than larger schools. And I just want to quote a couple sentences from it, Mr. Speaker. Small schools situated close to home are the best educational sites for children's education. Children are treated like human beings. They become, and they feel they experience the benefits on a daily basis. They serve the children and their communities very well, and it would be a backward step to close out schools like these. There's a growing number of educators and policymakers believe that existing assembly line schools inhibit our students' and teachers' potential, and smaller schools are better designed to support teaching and learning. And smaller schools produce higher achievement, lower dropout rates, greater attachment by the community, and more participation in curricular and extracurricular activities. So there's a mounting body of evidence, Mr. Speaker, that smaller schools are better. And I think this is something for the department and for the minister to keep in mind, that when the time comes to review a school and to see whether it needs to be enhanced or changed or in some respect, I think the evidence is there now that small schools are just as good, if not better, than larger schools. So, Mr. Speaker, I think the argument I'm making here that is twofold. One is that smaller schools are as good or better than larger schools, and secondly, I think when the time comes to review a school, rather than looking at trying to see how soon it can be closed out, it's rather how can we enhance it, how can we make it better, in what respect can we add to it or add programs or other government departments looking at it in the overall global picture to build up that school and to add to the economic activity within a school community. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to close, but I just say we need to look at a bigger picture. We need to think outside the box. We need to get some vision for supporting our rural communities and really maintaining our community schools. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and for the opportunity to address this topic, however briefly. And I'd just like to put it on the record that I think this is an extraordinarily important advance in the thinking of this province, that we are even looking again at the process by which we close or review the existence of schools. And I should start by saying that one of the kinds of politics that I could not engage in, and I decided at a very early age that I could not possibly engage in, was that of the schools and the school boards. And that's because the passion is so deep, so profound, and the emotion runs so high. This was as a parent, and I found it very, very disturbing that every time the children's place of education was discussed, threatened, changed in any way, shape, or form, parents became extraordinarily and deeply concerned. And so did other members of the community. And I think that goes to a very important element of what local schools actually mean. The school is, in the most real sense, the heart of the community. And it's also the earliest place that children encounter the community. It's a bit like a fish hatchery in reverse. Children start in a very small environment, few people in their family. They then move into a slightly larger pool of children who are the elementary school, typically into a slightly larger and often a more consolidated group, which is a junior high school, then into a larger high school again, consolidated schools. The consolidated high schools we have quite frequently throughout the province, and eventually into some form of post-secondary education or into the workforce at large. But there's a logical progression here, and it's the progression by which children enter into society. And society knows, whether consciously or not, that it is very important that children enter society in a safe, measured, and contented way from all points of view. You'll rarely find a more anxious group of people than the parents who are about to send their children off to school for the first time. They are deeply concerned, not even so much about what their children are going to learn as where they are going to learn it and who they will learn it with. And that's why the community school remains something so close to the heart of so many people. This is not a recent phenomenon by any means. In fact, the beginning of conscious urban planning in the 19th century saw most communities in North America planned around an elementary school. And this presumably was a recognition of the fact that children are educated close to their homes. Now, one of the things that I hope will be taken into consideration in this new school review process is what are the environmental, not just the cultural and social environmental, but the physical environmental concerns which arise from the location of a school. We've had a recent move toward the so-called walking school bus, but that's only practical when the school is within walking distance of the children's home, and that tends to be in the local school. The school bus, like many other forms of transportation, picks up the child at the doorstep or perhaps from a waiting car at a cold bus stop morning and takes the child to the doorstep of the school. At the end of the school day, the school bus takes the children away again, without necessarily leaving time for extracurricular activities, for sports, for play on the playground, for free play in the gymnasium. The child is taken home again by bus and returned. You can look at the greenhouse gas emissions, certainly of the bus. You can look at the greenhouse gas emissions of the parents whose child has missed the bus and who drives the child the entire way instead. You can look at all of these things. And then you can also look at the health impacts, rising obesity rates, children who cannot simply walk to school, who literally have to be transported there because the school is at such a distance. These are costs which actually reverberate for a long time throughout the health of our population. The child who is used to being driven to and from school is not the child who is used to walking. And that's not often the adult, that is frequently often not the adult who is used to walking. It may be the adult who needs a planned recreational activity, but it's not necessarily the person who believes they can simply go. And children develop physical health and a sense of empowerment from being close enough to their school, perhaps in increasing distances as they go into older and older grade levels, but they do have a physical connection to their locality, their community, and their school. My colleagues have spoken about the rest of the community's connection to the school, and I would wholeheartedly echo that. Frequently, you'll find in many small towns that the building which has been preserved, often for no particular purpose other than it's the school, is in fact the school. There's a great deal of nostalgia attached to these physical buildings. And why? Partly because people spent time there, but they also spent time in doctors' offices, banks, and grocery stores. And yet we see far less emotional attachment to that than we do to the local school. The place where children first were entrusted, the place where community meetings frequently took place, the place where basketball, badminton, numerous other recreational activities took place on the playground and in the school gym if there was such a thing. I'd also like to say that local schools, of course, or smaller schools, and it's important not to confuse the two, are often a place where children can see the progress of maturing into society within the school itself. I've always been interested in the P-9 school phenomenon, and even those schools which run from primary to grade 12, because the statistics show that these are actually, perhaps counterintuitively for some people, but these are actually places with a lower degree of violence in school. And what tends to happen is that you do develop a progression that small children see greater privilege available to the somewhat older children. They have something to aspire to. And older children often benefit by being seen as role models. And where one ends up ghettoizing narrow strata of age groups in any form of education, developing age groups, you run the risk of not having modeling, not having role models either offered or being the chance to be a role model. And both those things narrow the social experience of children. Sit down? Okay.
Order, please. There's too much noise in the chamber. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, as I was going to say, the experience of being in a closely stratified age group narrows children's experience, and it deprives them of the opportunity to mature in context in their community. Often they will seek another community. And I think if we have real worries about the social health of our community as a whole and of our developing children, and if we wonder or have concerns about what other communities' children are forming, perhaps we should ensure that in school, which is where they begin to spend large parts of their life, they do in fact have a viable sized community, something that's just not too big for a younger person to deal with. So I hope that these aspects, the health of the local environment, of the community, of the children's physically and socially, as well as that of the people with whom they will be living, are all taken into account when we look at the possibility of closing, amalgamating schools and the size of communities. It is a profoundly important process to the development of any functioning community. Thank you very much.
Now recognize the Honourable Minister of Education to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to say thank you to the members opposite who have shared their thoughts on the changes to the legislation. It is good legislation. It does reflect very clearly the responses that came from the public to the two-person team who was seeking that information. And it does address each of the 7 recommendations and parallels those nicely. I would like to acknowledge that the compliments that were sent forward by the members opposite towards the 2 people who did conduct that review, and they did listen, and they did hear, and they did respond with their report. I would also like to acknowledge that many of the comments came from educators on the other side, and I appreciate that. Also from people whose communities have gone through a school closure process. So I know you were speaking from experience, and I appreciate that. And I would also now like to call for the vote for Bill 145 and move it to law amendments.
The motion is for second reading of Bill 145, the Education Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill 145, entitled an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act.
Let the bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll call Bill number 141, Respiratory Therapists Act.
Bill number 141, the Respiratory Therapists Act. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I feel that I probably haven't spoken enough today, so I thought I'd maybe spend some time on this one. Very pleased to be able to introduce commence second reading on the Respiratory Therapists Act. Of course, we know that respiratory therapists throughout the province are committed to providing Nova Scotians with high-quality respiratory care. They are healthcare providers who assist in the diagnosis, the treatment, and health promotion of patients with cardiorespiratory disorders. They perform respiratory assessments of patients. They test, they monitor cardiopulmonary function, and assist with the transport of high-risk patients. So they do work quite often with our paramedics. There are approximately 200 respiratory therapists practicing throughout Nova Scotia, and this legislation will regulate the practice of respiratory therapy by ensuring that practice standards are established and maintained. The Act will establish a complaints and discipline process to enforce the standards and requirements and deal with concerns of the public. The legislation protects the public by requiring that respiratory therapists meet standards set out by a self-regulated professional body, a college. As we know how nurses, doctors, pharmacists, paramedics, and many other health professionals are regulated in our province. It is our belief that they are in the best position to regulate, of course, their own professions. We want to protect the public from improperly performed respiratory health care, and we want to ensure that legislation supports the governing bodies to take care of action when complaints are brought forward. We are able to introduce this much-needed legislation due to the collaborative effort and hard work of respiratory therapists, as well as the Respiratory Therapist Society of Nova Scotia. The Respiratory Society of Nova Scotia has worked very hard with the Department of Health to develop this legislation. Will improve accountability to the public, improve disciplinary processes, and allow more flexibility in the practice of their professions to better serve Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, this is another bill that has been a long time coming. As you know, they had been receiving their accreditation, as you will, from the Canadian Association of Respiratory Techs, and of course the National Association has gotten out of doing that, which precipitated the need to have their own regulated profession here in Nova Scotia. And I am proud of bringing this forward and, of course, opening second reading on Bill number 141, the Respiratory Therapists Act.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to stand and say a few words on Bill 141 and on its second reading here in the legislature. But I know there's many more individuals in this province are even happier than I am, Mr. Speaker, and that's the respiratory therapists here in this province. It's no secret to the government, to the Minister of Health, that this profession has been calling upon government for several years now to introduce legislation that would regulate or create the College of Respiratory Therapists here in the province. And the reason they were calling on the government, Mr. Speaker, is because the national body, as the minister stated earlier, who overseen the licensing of respiratory therapists for the country, had stated many years ago that they needed to get out of that capacity as an association or as a society, Mr. Speaker, and encourage the respiratory therapists themselves in each of their provinces to go back to their respective governments and encourage them to introduce legislation to oversee the governance of respiratory therapists here in the province, Mr. Speaker. So I know they're very relieved that this piece of legislation has finally come to the floor of this legislature and to start the process of creating the College of, I believe the College of Respiratory Therapists of Nova Scotia, or that is in the name somewhere there. But the one thing I do have to say is that it's important that we recognize the need for this legislation, because it does serve to protect the public interest, Mr. Speaker. We need to have regulations, policies, a governing body that oversees health professions like the respiratory therapists. It establishes and develops and promotes standards of practice for the profession so that they can move into other domains and other broader scope of practice here in the province, and hopefully contribute even more to the delivery of health care here in the province, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier, self-regulation is important because it also promotes the code of ethics that the profession has. And I know that the respiratory therapists of this province have been encouraging the government, as I have, to finally get to this point. But I do have to say to the government that, you know, this is pushing the limits to having this done in time, because, you know, as the national body had given the therapists of Nova Scotia ample time to approach government, the deadline for them to stop registering or overseeing this profession is December 31st of this year, Mr. Speaker. So from now until the end of December, or January 1st of 2008, we need to ensure that this piece of legislation passes through the legislature, that it goes through that process, but most importantly that the policies and the regulations are in place. And I know that the members of the society here in the province have been working hard to make sure that that's a quick process, that most of the regulations I think that they would like to see they have written. But I got to say, Mr. Speaker, it's a slow process. For myself, for example, Mr. Speaker, in the profession that I come from as paramedics, we worked years to get legislation to this chamber to promote the fact that we need a self-governing body to oversee the profession of paramedicine, Mr. Speaker, in this province. And I believe legislation passed maybe 3 years ago, I believe, or it may be pushing 4 years, and we have yet seen the completion of the regulations and the policies that are going to oversee that profession. So I'm encouraging the government that they need to move quickly, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the protection of Nova Scotians who receive care from therapists and respiratory therapists in this province have a regulating body. So it's good to finally see this come forward. Respiratory technologists play an important role here in Nova Scotia in delivery of health care, not only in the hospital setting, Mr. Speaker, but they're involved with in the emergency rooms throughout this province. They're involved with trauma teams, Mr. Speaker, on the Life Flight crews that we have for Life Flight that travel around the province, bringing those critically ill patients here to the tertiary care hospital in Halifax. They play an important role in that. They're on many of the transfers of the critically ill on ground ambulance when you have someone who may be in Cape Breton or in Yarmouth or even in Bridgewater. When they come up to Halifax, respiratory therapists are usually part of that team, along with other nurses, along with doctors, along with paramedics, Mr. Speaker, because we all know, and I know definitely how important respiratory is in healthcare and ensuring that patients are given the best possible care when it comes to airway management, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, the respiratory therapists play an immense role in ensuring that other professions like the paramedics, like nurses, like doctors, have the latest update in procedures and knowledge on what's the best way to treat a person who has a compromised respiratory system or a illness related to the respiratory system, Mr. Speaker. So I'm glad to finally see this coming. I hope that there's no delays in the creation of the regulations and policies over the next several months. And I know that the respiratory therapists in this province are glad to see this process finally come into light. And hopefully it'll go through this process quickly and to ensure that their governance of their profession continues and there's no interruption in that. So with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity to say those words.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill 141 is an extremely important piece of legislation whose time has come. This act regarding self-governance for respiratory therapists, as the minister indicated, there are some 200 in the province. 70 of them work in hospitals. As a matter of fact, I do know some of them. One of them, as a matter of fact, happens to be one of my sisters, who is a respiratory therapist at St. Martha's Hospital in Antigonish, which makes this a vital piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Minister. This is a governing body that's going to develop and maintain practice standards and qualifications, and it is become now, rightfully so, the norm for most professions in this province. Mr. Speaker, you know, it recognizes the autonomy of our professional organizations, and the respiratory therapists have been waiting for this for a very long time. It was in serious discussions began in 1999. So now they needed a governing body by the year 2008, next year, as the Federal Association is changing its mandate and will no longer allow licensing or to qualify respiratory therapists. So this needs to be completed by January of 2008. We can't leave this one on the back burner any longer, Mr. Speaker. This one is a piece of legislation whose time has come, like other pieces of legislation that have been left on the back burner by this government. So we're in favor of this self-regulating legislation, but we want to also caution that we do not leave all of the decisions to the council or the regulations made by Cabinet, and we are encouraged by the government's self-governing legislation. The legislature must be the body that has to ensure protection of our citizens. We can't leave those regulations to just the council or the executive council or the Cabinet to regulate and determine what's going to happen. So, having said that, Mr. Speaker, we look forward to this bill moving on to the next stage and any further debate on it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now recognize the Honourable Minister of Health to close debate on Bill 141.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I thank the members opposite for their interventions in this. I know that this is a piece of legislation that has been discussed on many an occasion and quite a bit over the last 10 years almost now. I think also it probably was important that we came to a point where we knew it was necessary, and maybe sometimes the department works better to a deadline. So I think that's where we're getting to this point. Also, I do want to make a bit of a point, and not to be overly controversial on this, but we do have a lot of governing colleges today for various health professions, and I think I'd like to take up a discussion someday with my honourable colleagues on maybe trying to find a way to amalgamate some of these and have a sort of a healthcare college. And I don't know, because a lot of time there's a lot of people doing a lot of the same thing, and maybe there's some efficiencies to bring some of these together. But Mr. Speaker, that is definitely a discussion for another day, and one that I will consult with a previous minister and maybe a previous minister as well. But I also like to bring up that discussion, I think, with some of my colleagues. So with that quick comment, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill 141, the Respiratory Therapists Act.
The motion is for second reading of Bill 141, the Respiratory Therapists Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill 141, entitled An Act Respecting the Practice of Respiratory Therapists.
Ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to call Bill 146, Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act.
Bill number 146, the Environmental Goals and Sustainability Prosperity Act. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise to move second reading of Bill 146, an act respecting environmental goals and sustainable prosperity. The growing recognition that human activity is a significant cause of climate change will have dramatic effects on the world's economy, on everyone's lifestyle. This bill is our province's response to that growing challenge. It builds, Mr. Speaker, on some of the best work government and the private sector have done on the environment and the economy over the past few years. The Green Plan and the Opportunities for Sustainable Prosperity, a document put out by the Department of Economic Development, are examples of the work that has been done starting in 2002. So is the Nova Knowledge Report on the environmental economy. We enjoy, Mr. Speaker, a very sophisticated economy, but it doesn't operate independently of the environment. Our economy needs countless commodities that we take for granted, that we extract from the air or draw from our waterways. And yet at the same time, our people need safe food, healthy water, and clean air. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that our quality of life flows directly from the environment. The environment is really another word for the commonwealth that we share. And so it follows, Mr. Speaker, that the healthier our environment will be, the healthier and wealthier our economy will be. This bill, therefore, Mr. Speaker, is about both the environment and the economy. In April 2006, a report from the President's Council on Innovation proposed that Nova Scotia aim to have the cleanest and most sustainable environment by the year 2025. Mr. Speaker, this bill calls for Nova Scotia to be internationally recognized by 2020 as having one of the cleanest and greenest environments in the world, 5 years earlier than what the President's Council on Innovation called for. It is, I confess, a very ambitious goal, but big ideas demand big achievements. The bill has more than 21 objectives as a way of establishing our goal, and the bill will hold government accountable for the progress towards these goals. Now, some of these goals, Mr. Speaker, are new commitments announced earlier, and some are new initiatives now being brought into legislation. Each year, the Minister of Environment and Labour, with advice from the Nova Scotia Roundtable on Environmental Sustainability, will report to the House of Assembly on progress towards these important goals. Mr. Speaker, perhaps the most ambitious project is for greenhouse gases. As outlined in the New England Governors and Eastern Canadian Premiers Climate Change Action Plan, this bill aims to bring greenhouse gas emissions down by 10% from the 1990 levels. That is a reduction of 35% from what would be anticipated if the government took no action. That may seem challenging, Mr. Speaker, but other jurisdictions such as the United Kingdom and British Columbia have already established equally, if not more, ambitious targets. But, Mr. Speaker, this goal of greenhouse gases is also bundled in with other important goals that deal with emission standards from automobiles, nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide emissions, renewable energy needs, commitments to protecting Nova Scotia landmass, and commitments to water resource management, particulates, septage, and wetlands. As stated, there's 21 different goals that government can and will be held accountable for. The responsibility for making this happen, Mr. Speaker, will fall to the green form of deputy ministers, 9 deputy ministers, and all announced earlier by the Premier. And Mr. Speaker, just as an aside, on this environmental plan, I do want to give credit to the Premier. When he ran for the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party, he ran on an environmental pillar, and when he ran as Premier of the province, he ran on an environmental pillar. And I want to point that out, Mr. Speaker, because some people have said that we're jumping on the green bandwagon. Mr. Speaker, when he made that commitment, he made it about a year and a half ago. long before the polls showed that this was the #1 issue for Canadians across the country. So I do want to laud the Premier for his foresight and for his vision, because, Mr. Speaker, this bill is one of the most ambitious and visionary bills that any political jurisdiction anywhere in the world is putting forward in terms of the environment and in terms of the sustainable economy. And I think it's important that its genesis came a year and a half ago. The economy and the environment must and will prosper together, Mr. Speaker, and this bill deals with that issue and deals with it in a very visionary way. I want to also mention that thanks to the party opposite to the third party, because they were the ones who provided leadership when our waste management plan came into operation. That waste management plan, Mr. Speaker, has been an environmental and an economic boom to the province of Nova Scotia, resulting in an environmental industry that employs more than 5,000 people and that is worth $360 million to our economy. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few words of introduction, I would take great pleasure in moving second reading of Bill 146.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure, too, to speak to this bill. This bill is certainly a step forward, and as such, it's absolutely laudable, and I know that many people in this province welcome the statement of the ambition to tame some of the environmental demons which have been plaguing us for quite some time and are doing so increasingly. I have to congratulate the minister. I'm very glad that he has been able to bring this forward in his caucus to get some real commitments, to following through on commitments that have, in some cases, been made previously, but certainly are made again. It's a great idea, although, as my colleague said earlier, the proof is in the pudding, and I am concerned that perhaps what we have here is more of a list of ingredients than a real recipe. And I don't know what the pudding is actually going to be like. Some of the words that are in here, and I won't finish them because we're not going clause by clause, but there are phrases here that really do concern me. There's quite a bit of talk about building on foundations and basing on principles, objectives, goals, the Governor in Council being able to make regulations, being able to make agreements about a very extensive list of matters, which I won't enumerate in whole, but they do include such things as analyses and sampling and data and measurements and verifications and protocols. They include the ability to make public and private funding agreements about sampling and options for meeting targets. All of these things, if they are decisions which are made in Cabinet, are not being made on the floor of the legislature here today. And it is important that we recognize that we are not being invited to debate the real hard details, the actual recipe for the pudding. There's a lot of talk, too, about goals and sustainable prosperity. And goals are indeed laudable, and I do see some hard numbers. Certainly the protection of landmass is something we have been working towards, all of us in this province, for a long time, and I hope that we will soon be attaining the 12% landmass, and that in fact that may turn out, as the minister said earlier, to be perhaps a minimum amount rather than a maximum amount. However, there remains some ambiguity about that still. The question of emission standards is a very, very important one, as are those of greenhouse gases. We have an exhaustive list of greenhouse gases. There's not room for any others, but certainly those which have been identified in the Act are going to be controlled, the numbers which have been mentioned in previous agreements of the province. What I want to know, though, is when we say that we must and will meet these goals, does must meet goals mean will meet goals? And how do we get from must to will? All of these are things which we are still going to have to look for in regulation and on the ground when the decisions are made. I have a tough time when I'm asked about what is your environmental policy. it's hard to come up with one because, as I've said before, environment literally means surroundings. And as all politics is local, all environment is local. And it manifests in many, many ways. And in some ways, the environment can be viewed almost as something we push against. It doesn't push at us. We push against it with our decisions. And so far, the decisions that have been made in this province, which have an impact, which push against the environment, our surroundings, our natural surroundings, have not always been ones in which it's a fair struggle. Sometimes our surroundings lose. And it has to be admitted when we look at the health status of this province that when our surroundings lose, sometimes we lose. We do not have a stellar record when it comes to the diseases, the chronic health diseases which can flow from impurities in air, soil, and food, and water. So we need to be looking at decisions on the ground which will have minimal impact on a healthy environment and leave us surrounded with healthy surroundings. So as I say, the Act is wonderful in that it makes firm and legal commitments to meet some goals which have been set out. They have been set out previously, and we are all grateful to see these things enshrined in another layer of law. The more the better. What I'm concerned about, though, is not what happens in this room, but what happens behind the doors of Cabinet. And there's a lot of detail left out here. So maybe this is a time to talk about some of the decisions which have been made, which haven't necessarily been uncompromising successes for the natural surroundings, the natural environment of Nova Scotia. Protected areas. It's taken a long time to get there, and there's still a lot of struggling about just what kind of activities are going to be permitted in the various levels of protected areas. We may protect 12% of the landmass of the province, but there remains a question as to just what kind of protection that is. We have wilderness areas, we have nature preserves, even provincial parks to some degree can be considered as protected. So we need to really look at just what protected areas are going to be. And I'd like to say in that regard, as a sort of an aside, that we have recently, in recent months, made provision for, what shall I say, the adoption of some fairly large tracts of Crown land into private hands, and that doesn't always entail protection. I think you'll remember that from the previous session. However, I hope that when it comes to the reality of protecting areas, that the lands will not only be acquired, but that they will be given significant protection once they're there. And I'd also like to suggest that another aspect of all this, we talk about sustainable prosperity. This has ramifications in tax policy as well, and I would like to see incentive for the protection of private lands as well. I note, for instance, that we continue to assess at whatever is the pre-existing type of assessment, donations of conservation easements and conservation lands. And perhaps that's something we want to look at again, is whether or not there should be a category of assessment which actually reflects the fact that land has been given over for conservation, and that in fact there has been a constructive gift of property rights, and that is of worth and should be of worth. So that's something that is within the hands of the province to deal with. Sorry, excuse me one second here. There's another area of protection, a place that the province has quite simply not taken up its jurisdiction as far as I can see, and it is an environmental jurisdiction. I would firmly argue that the protection of the intertidal zone is not just a question of natural resources owning the land between the high and low water marks. The intertidal zone is a fit subject for the jurisdiction of the province. The Department of Natural Resources does take it on. But what we have been experiencing as a result of great lack of coordination between various levels of government, all levels of government, I should say, is in some places almost unfettered infilling, elimination of the intertidal zone. When the sloping area, which is sometimes a beach and in some cases is protected by the Department of Natural Resources under the Beaches Act, but only when specially designated, when that sloping area is infilled with a vertical line, there is not only a loss of that, not only an extension of the municipal and provincial overlapping jurisdiction, there's also the complete elimination of an entire band of the biosphere. And that's an important band, in fact. There's a great deal moving, shall we say, in there. And in fact, even if you look at the decisions around the clam harvesters in the southern part of the province, these are the people who live and work, or who work, hopefully not live, in the intertidal zone. Speaking of that, living in the intertidal zone, we do need to worry about sea level as well. And I hope that in looking at sustainable prosperity, we are also going to be looking at at self-preservation, at ensuring that people don't build houses essentially below sea level. Because as anybody can tell you who's lived in some of the lower parts of this province, it's a dangerous practice. It is not sound for the environment, and it's one of those really very direct cases where what's not sound for the environment is certainly not sound either for the economy or for human health. Freshwater infilling is another place. There are numerous complaints and instances where, again, perhaps because of the multiplication or the multiplicity of jurisdictions, infilling happens. And once it's there, it tends not to be removed again. Very, very damaging. It can be done as a part of a building project, or it may simply be property extension. But where this happens, we are losing habitat. And I wish I had the figures, but they don't seem to be available as to just how many square feet of wetlands we lose. That brings me to another provision which does concern me in this Act, and I think that the concept is excellent, but I hope that the execution will be as excellent. And that's the phrase, no net loss of wetlands. It's not quantified. I assume that it means no net loss of wetlands in Nova Scotia. And other departments, federal departments, have policies of no net loss. And what that can mean is quite simply compensation elsewhere. So what I would really hope not to see is that you have, well, I can give at least one example, but that you have what's decided to be an unavoidable destruction of wetland, which is, again, an infilling usually, unavoidable, and therefore what you do is you create another artificial wetland elsewhere. I have to laugh, actually, because there's an area very close to where I live, right in the municipality of Halifax. An enormous amount of money has been spent recently in gouging out a marsh, removing the fill, and refilling it. And part of the project description is, and this is a place where people were in the habit of walking dogs, going for hikes, all the normal things that one does in a piece of, woods and marshland. But part of the project description is to create a wilderness. I have a little trouble with that, and I hope that we are not going to be creating wildernesses everywhere or creating wetlands as a result of simply replacing them, relocating them where they are inconvenient. This is perhaps a function of the fact there's another problem, or there is another large issue which we haven't really dealt with in this province, and that is around the issue of hydrogeological assessments. We don't have a good map of the water resources of the province, and we don't have a policy of mapping local watersheds when large areas of development are proposed. And this can have, as we've seen in Cape Breton, we've seen certainly in Harrietsfield and Herring Cove, numerous areas in, I believe it was the Cornwallis area before, I think it was the Cornwallis area, when you have intrusions into the water table, the water table moves itself around. It goes somewhere else. It may go into your basement, as I can tell you from personal experience, or it may go into the neighbor's basement, or it may simply flow through somebody else's septic field before it returns to the rest of the water table and other people's wells. These are real disturbances, and we need to know, we really do need to know what we are doing to the water table in any given area or to the watershed when we start intruding into it.
Order, please. Would the honourable member permit an introduction?
Of course.
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour on an introduction.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you willing to give time for an introduction, but I want to draw the attention of the members to the gallery opposite. Bruce and Connie Monk are here from Port Williams, the town where I was brought up in as a young person. Bruce is also the one who looks after my scooter, which does so much to help with greenhouse gases, as I mentioned. But more importantly, Bruce and Connie are the parents of Gina Monk, who's a page here in the House, who's standing beside them. So I'd ask the members to give Bruce, Connie, and Gina a warm welcome.
Indeed, welcome to our special guests visiting us in the gallery today, the Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and welcome. I hope you'll enjoy the proceedings, and I hope your daughter has been enjoying the proceedings as she watches them every day from the floor. So yes, as I say, it's very important that, in fact, we do have a good picture of the water which underlies the province as we interfere with it, if we are, in fact, going to interfere with it. And that's why the phrase "no net loss of habitat" is concerning. I hope we will more closely define it and say no net loss of, I'm sorry, I said habitat, wetland, no net loss of wetland within either a given distance within a watershed or other appropriate parameter. We'll need to see that more closely defined, I think, for it to be really meaningful. This Act talks a great deal about sustainable prosperity and about the waste industry. And it's quite true that waste is one of the most significant challenges to our natural surroundings and how we dispose of it. First, there's the question of extraction of resources, and secondly, there's the question of disposal. Everything from the emissions, the exhaust fumes that our cars put out, and the emissions from the incineration of tires, for instance, right through to the tires themselves that we need to throw away, the glass bottles, the Coca-Cola cans, the soil which may have been contaminated by a spill of domestic fuel oil, personal sewage, municipal sewage, septic, all of these things, all of the byproducts, in fact, of our activities are waste which must be dealt with. And we have a complex and industrial society which produces a complex and industrial range of wastes. Handling it is, as this Act recognizes, a massive industry. But we need to be very sure indeed that this is not only an industrial exercise, but that it is an environmentally healthy exercise. This is one of the places where the regulations really will, in fact, explain what can be done and what are going to be the details of this. There's a lot of other acts out there. There's a lot of other things that we do, decisions we make that have impacts on the environment. And I don't necessarily see, any provision in this Act that says it will trump, it will prevail over all other acts, which is almost what you would expect to see in such a broad statement. But even if it doesn't, I hope that it will in fact be considered, that it will be considered when the Department of Education makes decisions about closing schools. What does this mean for the amount of transportation that will be needed for people and children to schools, for materials to schools, for community activities that may need to take place in alternative facilities which may need to be built for possibly the tearing down of schools and the rebuilding of new ones. I hope it will be considered as well when we make decisions about, or in fact when municipalities even make decisions, and it should be noted that we don't have environment departments in municipalities as such, but that it will be taken into account when we make urban planning decisions as well, that we will look at the distance people need to travel to get to a grocery store. I should say that in my own area I have, as I've often told you, I have an interesting riding because it encompasses some relatively dense actually some very dense development along the shores of the Northwest Arm, and goes right out to communities of, like Pennant, of 20 families at most. People who do not any longer have access to a doctor, a grocery store, they never did have access to a bank right there, but who don't have easy access to any of the facilities that we, well, more than consider, that we actually do need in today's world. Also don't have transit. There's no public transit. And if a municipality is going to say, we will not zone for a store, a bank, a grocery, a post office, these are examples that I'm giving, in fact, more from my own childhood than from the moment, but I know that the decisions are still being made. If zoning forbids those things to exist in a given community, what is the impact on the environment going to be? I should note that, interestingly, one of my communities, there was a decision recently to open an agency liquor store, and that appeared to be largely something to minimize driving distance. There's not a doctor's office, and there's not a bank, but there is at least a local liquor store. So, and that was apparently, I'm told, to keep down the driving distances. So, you know, one does want to look at those kinds of decisions as well. And that's somewhere we have to engage municipalities. Municipalities have to be engaged in making environmentally sound decisions. Again, I don't see where this act does that, but I hope this act will do that, and I wish I wish everybody all success in gaining broad cooperation for the kinds of decisions that will need to be made. Public transit, again, a very real concern. If we don't have it, then people are going to be driving, and those greenhouse gas emissions are going to continue in full spate. I also I hear sometimes about other waste materials. There are rumors, and it's interesting because people are very concerned, and they've been concerned for a very long time about some of the materials that they feel have been certainly illegally, but nonetheless dumped in the woods, in water, in streams. And this is maybe a good place for me to say that one of those concerns I have, it was brought to my attention quite some time ago that there are places in my constituency, which I have not seen, where people take fluorescent light bulbs to dump them. And that, of course, is a problem because of the amount of mercury that's contained in them. And although a fluorescent light bulb, the conventional tube sort, may use less energy, and so does the new compact fluorescent light bulb. It may use less energy, but unfortunately, it is also mercury containing. And until our electronic waste regulations deal specifically with the disposal of mercury containing light bulbs, then we need to be careful about how cheerfully we mandate that everybody must use them, or if that's going to be the case. So there are always two sides to or at least two sides. There are, in fact, many sides to these decisions, and we can only hope that they will be made with due consideration. I really do, I commend the breadth of the act, absolutely. But there are a number of details lurking, and I hope the devil is not lurking in those details. as one of the important goals which has been stated, and it is quantified, and I'm very glad to see it quantified, is the one which says that by 2013, 18.5% of our electricity will be generated by renewables. Again, laudable, and I hope we're going to be able to get to it. We have an awful lot of mud to swim through while we try to get full access for renewable forms or alternative energy to the transmission grid. There's an awful lot of negotiating to be done. There's a tremendous amount of work, and there's still, it's still not being easy to get those alternative forms of energy hitched up to the grid. So we have a long way to go on that, and that'll be one of the more challenging ones, I suspect. So again, I hope that must is going to turn out to be exactly the same thing as will meet these goals. I don't know if I could go on, because there are so many different individual decisions that have had an impact on the Nova Scotia environment and continue to. And they're decisions that are being made every single day. We can educate as much as we want, but unless we provide the actual means to be environmentally responsible, it's going to be very difficult. I mentioned public transit a minute ago, and a particular bugbear of mine has been the loss of the public ferries, which used to traverse the Northwest Arm. And that's a particular bugbear of mine because I live on the number 15 bus route. And the number 15 bus route, as far as I know, has not changed since 1965 when it was taken over from Acadian lines. We're talking 2 miles beyond the Armdale Rotary. And that's not really very good. It has taken people once every 63 minutes, as far as I can figure, 63 minutes or 57 minutes. But it has taken people to exactly the same destination for years and years. And everything in that destination has changed, the demographics have changed, but there seems not to have been any significant investment in transit which says we actually want people to be taking a bus rather than driving around the Rotary. And that, of course, is what led to my interest in, seeing the old ferries, which used to so regularly traverse the Arm, all 2 minutes distance, moving people instead of cars. And we are going to need to focus on moving people instead of cars. And when it comes to the questions of parking on the peninsula or in any of these other constrained towns, because our towns in Nova Scotia, many of them follow very, very old urban planning principles and are designed to a tight grid, narrow streets, and they're just not particularly car-friendly. And I suppose the question is, why should they be? But they aren't car-friendly. They don't leave a great deal of parking room. And so people have an enormous amount of incentive, not just education, but incentive to get out of their cars, as they say. But we are not giving them the means to get out of their cars. I hear numerous complaints, and I have myself experienced what it's like to try to ride a bicycle through the denser parts of Halifax, and it is dangerous. It really is not something that one would recommend. So there are a lot of things that need to be done at the municipal level as well. This act is only going to have real teeth if it has the cooperation or if it has the engagement of the municipalities of the province, which make the on-the-ground decisions that so frequently influence our natural environment, whether they're in energy use or in waste disposal, whether they're in transit or in the zoning type of houses, all of these things. We need to have the engagement of local governments because all environment is local, just as perhaps all politics is local. I hope that that this act will be able to withstand the challenges that are going to come up against it, the challenges that are going to come out of the details. Right now, what we have is a number of problems of sewage and septic disposal. We have the problem of the tires, which have to be disposed of somehow, and it would appear that a decision has been made that disposal is okay as long as it recovers energy, just plain incineration or burning, energy recovery. And if that's going to be how recycling is defined in this province, then we may find ourselves perhaps with less waste, but with an awful lot more pieces of the waste in the air, in our lungs, in our food, in our soil, in our food, and in our drinking water. So I think we need to look very, very carefully at what kinds of proposals are made for the disposal of waste, because it doesn't, unfortunately, just go away. It changes form, but it just comes back smaller. So these are the kinds of details, like the question of the incineration of tires, that we're going to need to worry about in great detail. Excuse me, sorry. I hope as well that we're going to look at the questions of contaminated soil. Again, we've had an attitude for a long time that when things go, they just plain go away. And it seems to me if you decide that something, or if you have established that something is a problem, that it's a contaminant, and that it's not a safe thing to have around, it would be a good idea to know where it goes. And I have always been amazed at the truckloads of soil designated contaminated, which move freely around the province, it would appear, and sometimes seem to resurface in other areas. Maybe that's not the case, but we don't have a way of proving that it's not the case. And that is a source of enormous anxiety for a great number of people. It is, of course, a big piece of the testing industry and so on, is to find out, what's in the soil and where. And we do have to worry about our food supply. On that topic, another set of decisions which we've been having to make recently, which really could afford to reflect environmental concerns, is the set of decisions around local food. Local food, by definition, even if you call it food from within the province, or the Atlantic region, whatever you want to call it, or the town, local food hasn't traveled as far as it sometimes does. It's lettuce that hasn't traveled from California. It is pork that hasn't traveled from one of the western provinces. Local food may, and it may sometimes be food that has been grown by individuals in a community garden. And again, this is where the municipal government comes into play, because the difficulties that many people have established, I don't know how good they are as gardeners necessarily, they may not be, but without even being able to stick a shovel in the ground, many people have experienced enormous difficulties in being allowed to find a place to start off a community garden, which is a very popular way in many large cities in North America, and certainly has a long-standing tradition in Europe and Britain, a way of producing very, very local food. Doesn't need a whole lot of transportation. And these are the things that may seem unrealistic to people who aren't used to this. But these are also the kinds of small decisions that people need to be able to make. They need to be people need to be empowered. They need to be even permitted to make the decisions that will give us the environmentally sustainable prosperity that we're looking for. And if people are literally forbidden from making those decisions, forbidden from educating their children within walking distance, forbidden from visiting their parents in a senior's home which is not an hour's drive away, forbidden from growing food in a shared garden because they live in an apartment building, forbidden by the absence of transit from doing anything but taking a car, and in some cases forbidden from taking a job while living in a particular area of town, because if you can't afford a car and you can't afford transit, then you can't afford to work. All of these things, we are only going to have a sustainable economy and a prosperous province and a physically and socially healthy province if, in fact, this list of ingredients, which is the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act, turns out to have a real recipe behind it, to have some real details, to have some hard ability to make those decisions and say, we are going to even just not prevent certain activities, we're going to actually empower them. That may be a great deal to ask, but I think this act is an excellent step along the way. It's a statement of principle, and I hope very much that the principle will be backed up on the ground, in the air, in the water, in Nova Scotia. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's with pleasure I stand to talk regarding this bill. As the minister indicated in his open remarks, it's an ambitious bill with some very ambitious targets. It's unfortunate that we have to come up with these plans to protect our environment sort of at the 7th hour or the 9th hour, whatever you want to call it, when so many people are now talking about the environment and things that need to be done in the environment to protect things. You know, the environment is on the radar now, and as a whole world, we have to work together to try to make our environment a safer and better place to live, a place that's free of smog and all the other things that typically we didn't know existed in Nova Scotia many years ago. I can tell you now in the mornings when you drive into HRM from Porter's Lake where I live, there's on a still day, there's a orange cloud over the city. And probably before long, unless we make some changes to the emissions that are coming out of the stacks at different places in the downtown area, that many people are going to get ill from the orange smoke and possibly die from that orange smoke. And it's a sad state of affairs. I mean, one time you walked out of your home, and I can remember as a young man when I got my first vehicle, to clean the inside of your windshield in your car, you didn't have to do it very often. It stayed very clean. And now you can clean it today, and by the end of the week, you've got to clean it again. That just shows the contaminants that are in the air. And those contaminants not only on your windshield, but they're in your lungs and causing all kinds of difficulties, I'm sure, as we can see by our healthcare costs growing and growing. Now, the government talks about this bill, and I thank the minister and the staff for briefing us on the bill, and I think there's a lot of very good things in this bill. A lot of things that are long overdue, and I want to commend the staff and the department for moving, and the minister moving in this direction. But I do have many concerns, many concerns. I guess the most topical one at the present time is the burning of tires. Now, the minister continually says that there hasn't been an application, or at least last week he said there hasn't been an application from the cement factory or the cement plant to actually get a permit or approval from the environment to burn tires. However, the other arm of the environment, which is supposed to be a Resource Recovery Fund board, which is supposed to be clear of the government, I realize that. It was set up by our government to really reduce and recycle and reuse products, has awarded the contract to the Lafarge cement plant to burn tires. So there seems to be, on one hand, little effort to try and recycle this product. On the other hand, the minister says we haven't got an application yet, and I'm quite anxious to see the study that's been done by Dalhousie University and the terms of reference for that study. I'm more interested in seeing that than the study itself, because if the terms of reference, you can ask someone to do a study, and depending on your terms of reference, you can pretty well determine what your outcome is going to be. So I hope in this case it was a broad term, and the university was allowed to actually research this completely and check with the best experts in the world on this topic. I'm sure there's people out there that have done a lot of studies on this. So it's a real dilemma. Here we are talking about some very ambitious approaches in the environment to improve things in the environment. On the other hand, the Resource Recovery Fund Board is going to take away an opportunity to possibly recycle tires, that will actually aggressively go after some companies to do that, and maybe even help them financially. But instead of that, they gave an award to a cement plant to burn whole tires and actually pay them to pick them up. So not only getting free fuel, but they're getting paid to pick the fuel up. So it doesn't seem like it's much recycling in that thing, and I would ask, I'm very disappointed the Resource Recovery Fund Board has decided to take this decision, and I'd be very happy if they were to see their errors in their ways, and if they were actually to rescind that decision and then look at some other more attractive ways to reduce and recycle and reuse these tires in ways. And I know they've found other ways, and I think rather than paying someone to pick these tires up, they're going to burn them, they might want to put some of that money into a reuse program. And then we talk about, I asked last year in the estimates about the Minister of Environment of the year before about Nova Scotia Power and its emissions. And I was told at that time, if my memory is correct, and I'm sure the Minister will correct me on this if I'm not, but I think this is correct, that the Nova Scotia Power Corporation actually monitors its own emissions. Now, I've talked to some former employees of Nova Scotia Power that were involved in this process, and they indeed say the emissions are extremely high and are in some places in their plant, I understand that you have to wear Scott air packs to actually work. And this is happening today. And that's very scary. So if the employees have to wear Scott air packs, in other words, to breathe so they don't damage their lungs or their health, this material is getting outside the plant, so it's definitely going to hurt somebody outside the plant, even though it may be diluted. So that's something probably the Minister of Environment and actually under the labor section might want to look at to see if this is actually happening. And I've got no reason to doubt that it is. And maybe we can get some action taken there to protect the employees of the plant, who definitely wouldn't make a report for fear of repercussion, probably. Not that the Power Corporation is a bad employer, which they aren't, they're a good employer. But it just doesn't seem to make sense that right downtown Dartmouth you can have a plant that's got so many emissions internally, you have to wear a Scott air pack to work in there. And that's pretty dangerous stuff. Now, years ago I was trained to work at a heavy water plant in Glace Bay in Ontario under contracts there, and wear a Scott air pack, and the course we took there was 4 minutes to live, and it was with hydrogen sulfide. And that's a very nasty situation when you're dealing with that, and unfortunately people have died from that in the past, and I know there's no hydrogen sulfide at the, at least I hope there's not, at the Nova Scotia Power Plant in Dartmouth, or anywhere else they burn the Bunker C. But you can go on and on with all these different issues, and you see the environment getting worse and worse. You see our lakes suffering from acid rain. I can give you an example. On the East River in Sheet Harbour, there was a liming program that was promoted by the local organization in the area, which I give them a tremendous amount of credit for. When I was Fisheries Minister, and prior to my time as Fisheries Minister, the previous Fisheries Minister in our government at the time come up with a liming program for that river. Well, I can tell you, I'm an avid sports fisherman, and the fish that they're now getting out of that series of lakes and rivers are just incredible. They've grown a lot faster, they're a lot healthier, and that's all because of the liming process. Now, we shouldn't have to do these programs. And I realize acid rain isn't just from Nova Scotia, not created just here. is created in New England and in Ontario, and we're the recipients of a lot of acid rain. So we really have to work outside our borders too to help protect our valuable resource. And I can remember some family members that in the 40s in Nova Scotia, 1940s that is, that there was a vibrant business in the lodges and fishing resorts and things like that now are gone because of the acid rain and poor management. But at the same time, places like Newfoundland, and hopefully they'll protect their fish stocks and their wildlife stocks, have a very vibrant industry there. And the industry is indeed helping the economy. And these things do help the economy. So a good environment often means a very good economy. People want to come here. People don't want to go see garbage, and they want to see smoke coming out of smokestacks. They want to come to Nova Scotia, to a pristine, quiet environment, and to visit with the wonderfully friendly people we have here. Now, there's another issue here that hasn't been addressed in the bill, and it's one that I hope that the minister will comment on when he does his wrap-up on the bill. It's in the past, there was a problem of getting rid of solid plastics from manufacturing facilities. In other words, offcuts of sheets, chips from the machining process, and other plastics. And lo and behold, unless it's changed recently, you worked with these plastics, so you weren't allowed to put them in the garbage. You couldn't recycle them. In other words, you simply couldn't get rid of them. So what are you supposed to do with them? And a friend of mine who was in business and since gone out of business made several inquiries to the Environment Department a few years ago and was told, well, we don't know what to do with the stuff. The Resource Recovery Fund Board won't take it. You can't put it in the blue bag. You can't put it in the garbage. So what are you going to do with it? To this day, I don't know what he did with it, but I know he didn't dump it in the woods. Luckily, he could reuse some of the material, but some of it just simply couldn't. So that's an issue that really has to be addressed here in Nova Scotia. And a lot of this plastic that's properly identified can be recycled and resold and remelted and remolded into more products. But it has to be clearly identified to do that. And that would be easy enough to do, especially any manufacturer, because they want to know what products they're dealing with and what their scrap is from. So as you look through the process and see these things, it all comes together to paint not a very positive picture, a picture that could be very positive. I'm going to touch on illegal dumping. Well, in my constituency, one cleanup on one stretch of road cost this province $140,000. $140,000 to clean up the illegal dumping on one piece of road. And when you look at that and wonder, there was refrigerators, there was old cars, everything imaginable. It took dump trucks days and days and days to haul this away. And even with a $140,000 price tag, there was a lot of volunteer time and labor put into that cleanup. And now I go on that same road again, and lo and behold, it's piled full of junk again. Now, probably not the level it was before, because it was many years since that had been cleaned up. And probably wouldn't have been cleaned up. I was regional councillor at the time. Wouldn't have been cleaned up if it wouldn't have brought the CBC out to do a story on it. And as a result of that, Clean Nova Scotia got involved and worked with them very closely. And they worked with the province and the Department of Transportation. They did do the cleanup, and I thank them for doing that. But there's been nothing in the area to do prevention. There's been nothing in the area to stop this activity happening. The Resource Recovery Fund Board rewards the municipalities for recycling and reusing and the blue bag program. So the less garbage they have to put in the dumps, which is a great idea, and the more they can recycle, the bigger check they get from the province. That's fine. So what they do, the municipality comes along and says, well, you can take 10 garbage bags here a few years ago with garbage in them. That's too many, that's admitted. But now it's down to 3. So, luckily, there's one thing that saved us on this, is 3 program. The refrigerators and the stoves and all the parts with metal in them now have quite a significant value. So typically, even though the municipality frowns upon it, there's some entrepreneurs that go around and gather these things up and take them off to the scrapyard and can make themselves a handy day's pay if they can get a half-ton truckload of it. And I thank those people for doing that, because at least it keeps it out of the dumps and away from there. But the municipalities come up with a plan. You go to three green bags. That's great. So what do the people do that have 4 and 5? I can tell you what they do with them. Throw them in the trunk of the car, find the nearest properties that nobody can see them, and they throw them out. So instead of being able to deal with that garbage in a reasonable manner, now we got cleanup costs, we got pollution costs, we've got mess that's beyond unbelief when you see some of these dumps. And it's hard to believe. So I think that the municipalities have to be held responsible for some of this stuff. They're going to get a check from the province, from RFB, and I think that's a good plan. But if there's going to be cleanups done, cleanups to clean up this garbage that they will not take, then that should come off the check that the RFB gives the municipality. They'd only have to do that 1 year, and the municipality would come up with a plan and help eliminate this illegal dumping. It's not just the municipality's responsibility, it's all of our responsibilities as citizens and the province's responsibility as well. I remember doing a cleanup on the Montague Road, and that day, luckily, the RCMP was present, and they were helping with the cleanup too, and they found 3 garbage bags from 3 different homes that had exactly what I'm talking about happened. The garbage people wouldn't take the extra bag, they left it there. So a person threw it in the car, up the end of Montague Road, threw it out on the side of the road. Luckily, and they left their names in them. So the RCMP took the bags with the squad car, went over and knocked on the people's doors, told them, here's the garbage bag, it's your garbage. And I think there was a ticket issued at that time as well, which there should have been, and hopefully those people learned the lesson. But this thing shouldn't have to happen. It shouldn't have to happen. You know, we've got the Enviro depots. We've got Enviro depots in this province that do an excellent job. And a lot of those Enviro depots barely make a living. If it's in a small area, they use a small volume of product, they barely make a living. I mean, it's just been a few years ago that the government seen, and after I pushed and pushed and pushed through the municipality to get these people to take the paint, because paint was being dumped all over the place, to the Enviro depots, and actually turned it into a business for the people that pick up the paint and work with the paint. So it's been a very positive thing. So, and now RFB decided that the Enviro depots aren't going to take cardboard anymore. I mean, it was so simple for myself to take some cans and juice jugs and whatever I had in recyclables and my cardboard to the recycling depot. Because if I leave it out at the end of the driveway and it rains and it gets wet, guess what? Municipality won't take it. So what do you do with it? I can tell you, a lot of people dump it in the woods, and we can't have that happening. And, you know, people think in the woods it just goes away, but it doesn't. It causes a lot of problems. But if you go back to the Enviro depots, there's no reason Enviro depots can't take the propane cylinders. I was recently out to one of the places that refills propane tanks. And I had a tank that was expired over the 10-year period. And I said to the young man, I said, what do you do with these propane tanks? Well, he said, we take them and we ship them to another country, and lo and behold, they use them for another 10 years because they get a 20-year limit on it instead of 10. Now, why couldn't our RFB board find that out? Boys, it shouldn't be very hard. This company found it pretty quickly, and they actually sell these bottles they get for nothing and make some money off it. So it doesn't appear that everything is going the way it should be. Those propane bottles should be able to go back to the Enviro depots, be taken there, even if the RFB has to provide adequate storage facilities for these bottles until they can be properly taken away and looked after. It's the same as somebody has a refrigerator and they're moving away. Well, the municipality will come, at least in this municipality, and take the refrigerant out of it free of charge and tag it so that the garbage will take it away. And as I say, there's a lot of entrepreneurs out there now, they'll come along and pick the refrigerator up for HRM does and make a few dollars off it, and I think that's fine. But why couldn't the Enviro depots take these refrigerators and stoves if somebody was moving so they could drop them off there, especially the refrigerators, but then they could come in, the people that take the refrigerant out of it and do several refrigerators at one time, save the municipality a lot of money, and also have the facility there to do that. It'd be so simple to do. And would make a few extra dollars for the enviro depots and just make it easier. You've got to make it easy for people. If you don't make it easy, they'll break the rules. It's that simple. So you could have the enviro depots taking propane cylinders with proper training and proper storage facilities that RFB could invest in, because there's not that many of these small businesses around. They could take waste oils. Waste oils now have a value. If someone changes their oil at home, they could take it in there and put waste oil in a facility, providing they have the proper storage facilities, which are available. These things are available. And have these things recovered and pay a fee to the people that do this stuff, to the enviro depots, to make sure they can make some return on the work they do. And the list goes on and on. I mean, there's so many things that these little businesses could be doing to make it simple for Nova Scotians to get rid of what we consider as trash. And when you really look at this, there's possibilities are unlimited. So, you know, the province just announced e-waste. Now, we're going to handle e-waste. We're going to burn that like we're going to burn the tires? I hope not. Possible. RFB is going to look after it. It may happen. I don't know. But a lot of this e-waste could be used over again. Some very precious metals that may be difficult to extract from there, but there's got to be ways to do this. I come from an entrepreneurial background, and a problem is an opportunity. But if you're not allowing entrepreneurs access to these opportunities, the opportunities will never become profitable. And that's what you have to do with opportunities. You have to create these. And we've got some of the best entrepreneurs in the world right here in Nova Scotia. You travel all over the world, and who do you see when you're on business trips? People from Nova Scotia selling their goods and their ideas and their expertise and their products. People all over the world. You give these people the tools to work with and the opportunities, they will make a business. They'll employ people. They'll take products that were junk and turn them into something that they can make money with. But they've got to have seed money. They've got to have opportunities to do this, and they've got to have research to show that it's possible to do it. So, you know, when you look at the environment, there's so many economic opportunities that it's impossible to imagine what they all are. But you've really got to set up an environment for these things to work. And you've got to say to small business, we've got close to 1 million tires a year. How can you make money off it? And what do you need to make money off that? What startup costs do you have to get this going? It could be as simple as I've had discussions with the RFB about chipping the tires into chunks and use them for aggregate under road beds. Use them in septic fields and other things. And their solution to it was, well, nobody was interested in investing in that equipment. Well, why didn't the RFB invest in the equipment and get portable equipment if it's possible to get, and I'm sure it is, and go around to these gravel pits that could use this product and chip these tires up at a small fee and do it, and they've got really cheap aggregate and something that you can move when the roads are closed. You could move a truckload of this material where you can't move a truckload of gravel and probably get some work done that you couldn't do in the off-season, which would help the construction industry and would also help the environment. But no, they couldn't think of that. You know, they just wanted someone to come in and fix everything for them and just walk away from it. You know, I'm not beating on the Resource Recovery Fund Board because I think they do an excellent job in some areas. But there's so many areas that could be improved and so many positive things could happen for Nova Scotians. Could you imagine if you could take those nearly 900,000 tires, or 900,000 plus tires in Nova Scotia, and employ 40 or 50 people a year, reusing and recycling and reducing these to products that can be used? Just think of the economic impact. And you know, rather than just burning these things, I mean, I know the cement operation needs cheap, reliable fuel, but fuel at what expense? At the expense of Nova Scotians, at the expense of Nova Scotians' health. So I think the IRP's got to do a better job on this, and it's up to the government to demand that this process stop. And also tell the IRP, give them a directive that they're not allowed to burn these tires and stop the process. I can't see that happening. And rather than doing that, and I've got a lot of respect for the minister, but the minister says we haven't got an application yet. Rather than saying to the RFB, look for other places and other things you can do with these tires, because we're not going to give approval for this, period, regardless of what the environmental review does. Because down the road, you know, years ago, there was so many things that were safe, things we were told were safe for us and safe for our health. You know, all the PCBs that used to be in the car seats at one time were safe, but we've sure found out they're not safe anymore. So how do we know what's going to happen when we burn tires? I know it's going to be a lot of smoke and a lot of problems and a lot of things, emissions that come out of that dear knows what it is doing to our health. I mean, if you get a permit here in the regional municipality to burn brush, which you can get in some of the rural areas, and you take a tire and put it underneath that pile of brush and light that fire, you can get fined for burning that tire. Now, why is the municipality going to fine you for burning the tire when the province is going to say it's okay to burn tires? So there's something wrong with this picture altogether. So I think that the province had better review this whole situation and stop even considering burning tires. I mean, it just doesn't make sense in today's environment. You know, as you go through this whole process, and you see the targets that the environment set in this bill, and there's some pretty ambitious targets. But I'll go back again to the monitoring of Nova Scotia Power and other large facilities, and ask them how they're actually monitoring each individual facility. Now, I know they have air monitoring systems all over the province, but it's better to have those as well as have an individual monitoring at the actual sites where the facilities are, to see who's responsible for these pollutants that are going in the air, see who is actually responsible, get the proof of this. And you know, you can put the fox in the hen house to look after the hens, but soon you don't have any hens. You know, it's a sort of an old analogy, but I can tell you, you let someone burn whatever they want to burn and take no responsibility for anything, all of a sudden you're going to find that they're doing whatever they can do to make a dollar and really don't care about the environment. I remember years ago that everybody was smoking and it was great for your health, there's no problem at all, and we've sure seen the people that get all the different cancers that come from smoking and the lawsuits that have been waged and won against the tobacco companies for the health hazards they've created. So it makes you wonder, you know, when we're going to monitor things, the Department of Environment should be doing the monitoring. And not only should they be doing the monitoring, but for the large companies and the companies that are suspect of being polluters, that monitoring should be paid for by not the taxpayers, but by that company. And it should be done by the Department of Environment under their supervision and monitoring under a quality assurance system that guarantees we're getting the right information, guarantees that we're knowing exactly what's coming out of the stacks and being dumped down the sewers and everything else. You know, there's another issue, you know, that I haven't heard talked about very much around here, is the chemicals that are being dumped in the sewer system. So someone has some chemicals and they want to get rid of them. They don't have to account for them. Where do they go? Down the toilet, down the drain, and then where do they go? Well, right now they go in the harbor. And we wonder why we've got such pollution in our harbor. I know I've been out there fishing and pulled the anchor up after we fished, and there was this black sludge up the rope probably about 8 or 10 feet that's laying on the bottom of the harbor out here. And I've talked to some divers that have been down in that working in that environment, and they say it's unbelievable. So hopefully this sewer treatment system that the city is putting together here is going to help this, but really all that's going to do is chemically treat the sewer and take the solids out. Well, that'll clean up some of our beaches, some of the plastic components that happen to get on the beach, but it's not going to do much to really clean it. So hopefully someday that the province will see its way fit to really help the municipality and go into a tertiary sewage treatment system here in HRM and set a standard. I know when I was on council and trying to get funding for this process, it was very difficult from the province to get that, and they were the last holdouts in order to make that project work, and I think the smallest funder of anybody. But it's these things we have to look at. How many chemicals are going into our harbor every day that we don't know about? The unseen poisons that are going out. And people don't talk about these because you don't see them. They're not in the air. And you don't see them in the water because the harbor here flushes so much every day that only occasionally would you see something like that, and it's diluted by so much when you get there. But the dilution and some of these chemicals can go, very few parts per million can do a tremendous amount of damage. And when you look at that damage and what it does to the ecosystem, and remember too, when all this stuff is going in the harbor here, and not only this harbor, but other harbors, other sewage treatments over Nova Scotia dump directly in the harbor. Don't forget, you're eating the lobsters that feed on the bottom, you're eating the fish that come out of there, and everything else. So you're picking up toxins in your food chain. And you have no idea when you go to one of the local lobster supply places here where that lobster was caught, or if it's contaminated or not. And there's really no test to see if that lobster was contaminated, none. Or if that fish was contaminated, there's none. So you eat these things in good faith and hope you don't get sick. And the trouble with a lot of these cancers are, you probably are getting sick for many, many years before anything shows up. And the more and more people we see with cancers and other respiratory diseases and other diseases that are caused by partially from our environment, or our work environment, our living environment, our home environment, it's more and more difficult to identify what's happening to people. And we see the health minister stand up and says every day that we can't afford this drug for somebody that's dying because it would cost us too much, and another drug we can't afford. And we're getting to a point in healthcare that if you have money you live, and if you don't have money you don't live, which is a sad state of affairs. But if we could stop those diseases from starting, we wouldn't have to have all these costs. And that's where we really have to aim. And I think we're many, many years away from that. It's good to see when you talk to people today, they're acutely aware of their environment. And they're very, very concerned about the things. You talk about radon gas and things that come up from underneath the concrete in your home. One day you didn't know what that was. You've got carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide monitors in your home. People didn't have those years ago and didn't need them at that time, or didn't appear to need them. So all these things are getting more and more, prevalent in our society. And some of the things we can't really control here in Nova Scotia. We can control some things, we can improve some things, we do the best we can. And the targets that the department have set to reduce the emissions, I don't think they'll make them. They didn't make their last targets they set. They really didn't come close, not even close. So it's nice to set targets. I mean, we can set a target that we're going to pass 50 laws tomorrow. Guess what? We won't even pass one. But I mean, that's the reality of what's going on here. And we're going to set these targets. We've got to get serious about them. We've got to make it easy for people. We've got to help educate people. We've got to educate ourselves. And we've got to take the best possible scientific evidence we have. Now, sometimes that's not relevant, not obvious, I should say, not obvious. Because a lot of things, I ran a business for a long time, and I always thought that some of these products we were making lots of money on. So when I put a job cost system in place, I found that the ones I thought I was making money on, I was losing money on, and the ones I thought I was losing money on, I was making money on. Because I didn't have the monitoring tools before that to do it. But once I got those monitoring tools, I made money on everything. So, you know, you've got to have the monitoring tools there. You've got to know what you're dealing with in order to correct it. So, for instance, if the Nova Scotia Power Corporation is monitoring their own stacks, and they are, they're monitoring their own stacks, so the information potentially is filtered before the Department of Environment gets it. I wouldn't say that it's tampered with, because I don't think they do that, but it's filtered. So if the Department of Environment and Health says, okay, we've got a problem with a particular chemical, and that chemical has caused this disease, and they go look at the records of the Nova Scotia Power, well, those guys aren't causing a problem because they don't have that much of that chemical. But if you really did the test the way they should be done, maybe they do have that chemical, and maybe they're the source of that problem. But if they are, then they need to be legislated, so they change that. Maybe they're not the source of it. Maybe the source comes from New England. Then we have to get after New England to get rid of this for our sake and for their sake as well. Or maybe it comes from Ontario. But these things only can be resolved if you know what you're dealing with. And quite frankly, I don't believe the Department of Environment knows what they're dealing with here. Not because we don't have good staff, because we do have good staff. And not because they don't want to do this, it's because we don't have the structure to do it. And I'm not sure this bill will give us a structure. It's like anything. If you're growing a garden and your plants don't grow, what do? You just give up gardening? No. You start to find out what's wrong with your soil. Maybe you didn't water enough. Maybe you don't have the proper fertilizers, or if you're not going to use fertilizers, use the natural fertilizers. Maybe you have to lime the ground. Maybe there's too much gravel in it. Who knows? But you'll find out very quickly what's wrong. But you'll do that by doing due diligence, investigation, and trial and error in that case, if you're not a farmer, because a farmer could probably come and look at the soil and say it's no good, nothing to grow anyway, because they've got the experience. But if we don't have that kind of expertise and we don't do those kind of measurements, we are not going to be able to know what we have to do and what we have to fix. Because some of these things, if we could monitor these things and say, okay, we have to eliminate SO2. We have to get rid of it in our air. So let's find out who's putting it out. Let's find out where the sources are, what you have to do to clean that up before it comes out, and a way to monitor that when you're done, that you know you've accomplished your goals. But no, we don't have any of that. And we don't have any source evaluation where this stuff comes from. So until we get structures put in place that will tell us what our problems are in real terms, in real time, and then how those affect our health, our environment, and everything else that's going on, how can you fix it? It's like taking your car, the real simple analogy in, and saying the transmission's slipping, and the mechanic says, nope, your motor's gone. And guess what? It's your transmission's still slipping when he puts a new motor that you don't need in your car. And that's, if we don't do the testing here to know exactly what it is, how are we going to fix it? So, and I still think to this day, and I don't think I'll ever change my mind on this, the companies that they're providing or causing the pollution in this area should be paying for the monitoring by an independent company or by the Department of Environment, but either way, under the complete control and monitoring of the Department of Environment. I know this bill will give the minister and the department some more tools, and the more tools they have, the better, as far as I'm concerned. We really have to work on these things to ensure that we get the information. We have to be innovative, and we have to be persistent. And with Mr. Speaker, with those words, I would like to adjourn the debate for today and take my place again to finish the rest of my time another day.
Debate has been adjourned. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader on House Hours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, that concludes the government's business for today. I move the House be adjourned to sit tomorrow at 12 noon to 8 p.m. Following the daily routine, question period will follow daily routine and the estimates for the Department of Health. And if time permits, Mr. Speaker, perhaps second reading and public bills.
The House shall now rise and meet again tomorrow at the hour 12 noon to 8 p.m. We stand adjourned.